Road dust cakes his skin, beneath it a crust of dried blood and sweat. He walks alone. His sandals slap against stone, and that sound is the only sound, because a city that should be screaming with joy or howling with grief is doing neither. It waits. That silence is a sentence being prepared. He lived through the battle, the clash of bronze on bronze, the screams of men he had wrestled with as a boy. He came home, and that is the problem. He is not walking toward a feast, not toward a warm hearth or a father's grip on his shoulder. He is walking toward one stone house, one low doorway, one woman, the woman who carried him, fed him, sent him out with his shield. He already knows what he will see in her eyes when she opens that door. Not relief, not tears of thanks, something colder, a measurement, a verdict she will pass without a single word in front of every neighbor on the street. He dodged the enemy's spear. He may not survive his own mother's stare. We remember the wrong people. We remember the kings in bronze, the phalanx bristling with spears, Leonidas at the pass, the agoge, that training pit where Spartan boys were starved and beaten into weapons. We picture men when we picture Sparta. That is a mistake. The true enforcer of that state, the presence that frightened its own soldiers more than any invading army, was not a man at all. She was a woman, and her weapon was her love. The words survive. Historians like Plutarch wrote them down, and they are not legend. They are not campfire boasting dressed up as history. They are commands, sentences spoken by mothers to their sons at the city gate, before the boy had even set down his shield. These women were shaped by the state from birth for one task: produce perfect soldiers, discard the ones who came home defective. Their bodies were the first barracks Sparta ever built. Their affection was not shelter. It was a blade, and it was pointed at their own children. This is what happens when an ideology swallows a state whole and turns the oldest bond a human can have into a tool. Think about it. The person who gave you life becomes the person who might end you, by law, by custom, ordered to cheer your death in battle as the finest thing she ever did, ordered to treat your survival as a stain that has to be scrubbed off the family name. That was the world of the Spartan mother, and we are about to walk into it. We will uncover the living punishment she was forced to build for any son who broke his one sacred duty, which was simply to die well. A system of control so total it made the source of life into judge, jury, and executioner in a single body. You have never heard it told like this. Before we go down into that world, tell us the city and country you are watching from in the comments below. And if you believe these stories deserve to be told, take 1 second to subscribe. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. Athens had a nickname for them, and it was not kind. Phaenomerides, thigh flashers, grown men from other cities came to Sparta and stood at the edge of the dromos, the running track, and what they saw sent them home with stories. Girls sprinting across packed earth, wrestling until the dust caked their shoulders, hurling the discus, the javelin cutting a low arc over the field. Their tunics, the peplos, were pinned high and left open along the flank, so every stride bared a leg from ankle to hip. To an Athenian, this was obscene. It was the natural order flipped on its head. A woman's body belonged behind 4 walls, veiled, quiet, working wool by lamplight. Here it moved under open sky, sweating, hard with muscle, and it did not apologize. The poet Ibicos of Rhegion, who lived in the 6th century BC, sneered at these women as phanomerides in a fragment that survived precisely because the insult stuck. Euripides picked up the same charge later. He put words in a character's mouth about how no Spartan girl could stay chaste, running half-naked beside the young men. That is what outsiders saw. Scandal. They missed what was actually happening in front of them. Those men were not watching girls kill an afternoon. They were watching a nation build its most valuable machinery. The entire Spartan design, the war state that later Greeks credited to the lawgiver Lycurgus, did not begin in the barracks with a boy and a spear. It began earlier than that. It began in the womb. And in Sparta, the quality of a womb was not a private concern. It was a matter of state survival, argued over by the elders in the Gerousia, the council of men over 60 who ran the city's oldest business. A Spartan girl belonged to the city from the day she could walk. Her raising was public, done in the open, watched by everyone. Call it what it was. A breeding program stretched across a whole society. In Athens, a girl the same age was shut indoors, taught to be seen by no one and heard by less, married off at 14 to a man twice her age. Her Spartan counterpart trained like an athlete under a coach. Xenophon, an Athenian who lived among the Spartans and admired them, set it down in his Constitution of the Lacedaemonians with the flat tone of a man counting stock. Their food was plain, measured, controlled. No rich excess, no soft flesh. They ate rations that matched the young men's. They were banned from weaving because weaving was slave work, left to the helots who held the whole system up from underneath. Their assignment was different. Build muscle, broaden the hips, turn the body into a vessel strong enough to produce the one thing Sparta cared to make: soldiers. Their strength was never meant for them. A Spartan woman did not race to win glory for her own name. She raced because the elders had done the arithmetic. Strong mothers, strong sons. A woman who had never tasted weakness could not hand weakness down. Every drop of sweat that fell on that training ground was a coin paid toward the phalanx that would stand 30 years later. The women were the first wall Sparta ever built. Before the bronze, before the 8-foot spears, there were their bodies. The city marked this in ritual. At the festival of the Gymnopaedia, held in the searing heat of the Laconian summer, the naked youths danced in the agora while the whole population watched who moved with strength and who faltered. Unmarried men who had dodged their duty to father children were shamed there in public, driven around the marketplace, forced to sing a song against themselves. Plutarch records the detail. Even the calendar of Sparta was a machine for sorting the strong from the soft. Out of this forge, the girl became a woman. She married late by Greek standards, often not until 18 or 20, because the elders had decided a mature body bred stronger children. The wedding itself was strange to every other Greek. Plutarch describes it in his Life of Lycurgus. The bride's hair was cropped short like a man's. She was dressed in a man's cloak and sandals and left alone in a dark room. The groom, who still lived and ate in the barracks with his fellow soldiers, slipped in by night and slipped out again before dawn, back to his messmates. Some men fathered children before they ever saw their wife's face in daylight. Marriage was policy, arranged with the cold logic of livestock breeding. A husband past his prime might even be asked to lend his young wife to a stronger, younger man, so the city could harvest better offspring. Plutarch states it plainly, and he does not flinch from it. But none of that was her true work. Her true work began the first time she held her own son. There was no lullaby, no whisper of a long life and a warm old age. There was the code and nothing beyond it. And before she even had the boy, the state had already ruled on whether he was allowed to live. Plutarch records the practice at a place called the Leuctra, near Mount Taygetus. The father carried the newborn there, and the elders of his tribe examined the child. If it was well-formed and sturdy, they let the father keep it, and assigned it one of the city's plots of land. If it was weak or malformed, they carried it to a ravine on Taygetus called the Apothetae, the deposits, and left it there to die on the rocks. The mother learned only afterward whether the thing she had labored to bring out was permitted to breathe. That was the first inspection of a Spartan life. It happened days after birth. So the boy who survived the ravine grew, and at some point in his childhood, his mother set an object before him. A shield, the aspis broad and curved, 3 feet across, wood-faced with a skin of bronze, heavy enough to drag a grown man's arm toward the ground. And she spoke the words that outlasted Sparta itself, the words Plutarch preserved in his sayings of Spartan women. She looked her son in the eye, Atean, epites, with your shield or on it. People treat that line like poetry now, something to cut into marble. It was nothing of the kind. It was a contract, and it was cold to the touch. It set the price of her love before he ever left home. Come back carrying this shield, and you are my son. Come back dead upon it, borne on the shoulders of men who did not run, and you are still my son. 2 doors. There was no third, because a man who came home without his shield had done one thing only. He had let it fall so his legs could carry him faster. A hoplite's shield was not his private gear. Its left edge covered the man beside him. Drop it, break the line, and you announce to the entire phalanx that your single life outweighed the man at your shoulder. That was the crime that could not be forgiven, not fear. Every man on that field was afraid. The crime was choosing yourself over the line. So in 8 syllables, a mother laid out the terms of a boy's whole existence. Your life is not yours. Your body is state property, loaned to you, and the loan comes due on a battlefield. Bring it back with honor, or do not bring it back. Her love, his name, his seat at the family table, his right to be mourned instead of scrubbed from memory. All of it hung on one condition, his willingness to die. That was the first lesson a Spartan mother taught. It was the only one that mattered. The women did not soften with age, they sharpened. As they grew older, they became the living archive of the code, the ones who kept it burning while the men marched. With the army gone, the older women ran the city's honor like a court that never rose. Their weapon was shame, and they used it in daylight, in the open, in front of everyone. In the agora, at the syssitia, the common mess halls where every man ate the same black broth, along the streets, their eyes moved and measured. They knew who had flinched. They were the first to name a coward, and they named him loud. Sparta had a word for such a man, tresas, a trembler, a man who lived through a fight he should have died in. Xenophon set down what awaited that man, and the list is long. No one would marry his daughter. He could not take a wife himself. He paid a fine if he did. He was struck in the street and had to endure it. He wore a cloak patched with different colors, so all could see him coming. He shaved half his beard and left the other half to grow, a walking mark of shame. The trembler was a dead man still breathing, and the women made sure the city never let him forget it. They composed songs about the tremblers, so the disgrace could be sung on corners and carried in the mouths of children. Plutarch Plutarch kept a story that shows the bone under all this. A Spartan mother traveled to another Greek city. There, her son was being praised, the locals crowding around to tell her how brave he was in the line, how skilled with the spear, how fortunate she was to have raised him. They waited for the proud smile. She gave them nothing. She stood still, her face set like carved stone. One of the hosts, unsettled by her silence, finally asked why she said nothing when such fine things were said of her own child. She turned to him. "Because I bore him to die for Sparta," she said, "not to be complimented for living." The silence that followed was the sound of two worlds grinding against each other. One measured a life by what it built and enjoyed. The other measured a life only by how well it was spent. To her, the praise was an insult. It celebrated the wrong ending. Her son still drew breath, which meant the purpose she had carried him for was not yet met. Her work was not done. Neither was his. Plutarch stacked these sayings one on top of another, and the pattern never breaks. One woman handed her son his shield and told him to bring it home, or be brought home on it. Another, hearing her son had died holding his position, said she was glad she had borne him for exactly that. Another buried her boy and cut off a woman who came weeping in sympathy. "By the gods," she said, "a good thing has happened to me. I bore him that he might die for Sparta, and this is the very thing that has come to pass." These are the sayings the Spartans themselves chose to remember, not the ones they hid, the ones they were proud of. And then there is the darkest of them all, also in Plutarch. A mother met her son coming back from a lost battle. He was alive. She asked him how Sparta fared. He told her the whole army was destroyed. She picked up a roof tile, threw it, and killed him where he stood. Then she said the city was better off with him dead than with the false news he had carried, since a true Spartan would have died with his comrades. Whether it happened or not, the Spartans repeated it. It was the ideal they aimed at, a mother who would rather execute her son with a piece of her own roof than let him stand as living proof that a Spartan could survive defeat. A system this total cannot run on fear of a distant enemy. It needs enforcers inside every home, people who have swallowed the ideology so completely they police it on themselves without being told. Sparta needed no secret police for its own citizens. It had mothers. Their love and their shame were the two hands that turned the whole machine. An enemy's spear was far off and abstract. A mother's disappointment was here now, inescapable. It rode with a man from the ravine at Taygetus, where he had first been judged, all the way to the front line. It was the voice inside his skull as he locked shields and waited for the charge to break against him, with it or on it. A soldier could imagine surviving a wound. He could not imagine surviving her eyes if he walked home with empty arms. These were not bedtime tales the Greeks invented to scare children. They were reports, and the Greeks believed them. They shaped how the rest of Hellas regarded Lacedaemon, that strange power down in the valley of the Eurotas. When Aristotle later dissected Sparta in his Politics, he noted with unease how much control the women held, how they owned nearly 2/5 of the land, how the men who ruled the battlefield were ruled at home by their wives. Here was a people who had taken the family, the one place a human being is meant to be loved for simply existing, and hollowed it out. In its place, they built an assembly line for the state. Husband and wife, parent and child, all of it ranked below one bond that mattered more. The bond between a Spartan and Sparta. And the women were not victims trapped in this. They were its sharpest tools. Sparta handed them a public voice and a share of power no other Greek woman would touch for 1,000 years. Land, standing, the right to speak and be feared. When a foreign woman, said to be the wife of King Leonidas, remarked that Spartan women were the only ones who ruled their men, the Queen Gorgo answered that this was because they were the only ones who gave birth to men. Plutarch kept that exchange too. It came at a price, and the price was steep. They had to trade away the one instinct that defines a mother across almost all of human history. They had to love the state more than the child they had carried out of their own body. It is one thing to recite a code of honor in the abstract. It is another to watch what the code does when it stops being words and becomes flesh and blood in the dirt. So, put the theory to the test. A battle has been lost. The famous phalanx, the pride of Greece, the wall that was never supposed to break, has broken. It happened for real. At Leuctra in 391 BC, the Theban Epaminondas shattered the Spartan line, and around 400 Spartiates of the roughly 700 present died in a single day, King Cleombrotus among them. It was a wound Sparta never recovered from, and the survivors trickled back after such days in twos and threes, some alone, all wounded, filthy, done. And they walked home, not to Athens where a beaten man might be pitied, not to Corinth where he might be quietly understood. They walked back to Sparta, where survival itself was the charge against them. And after Leuctra the crisis was so sharp that even the tremblers could not all be punished, because there were too many of them, and the city could not afford to lose the numbers. The lawgiver Agesilaus was asked what to do about the laws against cowards. He answered that the laws should be allowed to sleep for a day. Sparta bent its own iron rule because the alternative was collapse. That was how deep the wound went. This is exactly the kind of buried truth we dig up here every week. Stories time has scrubbed clean, or dressed up in glory, or dropped down a hole entirely. Building these documentaries, giving them the depth and weight they deserve, is heavy work. It runs on a small circle of viewers who decided to stop being spectators and step inside. They joined the lineage, our membership. When you join, you are not tipping a channel. You are on the crew. You are part of the inner circle making sure this dark history gets told the right way, unsanitized with the research it demands. That core group keeps the forge lit. It pays for the hours it takes to go this deep. If you count yourself one of us, if you believe this is more than something to watch on a screen, step into the ranks. You get early access to new investigations, and you become a direct patron of the work. Help us keep the fire burning. Now picture one of those survivors. His name is gone, lost like most of them, but his story stands in for every Spartan who ever failed the test. He limps the last miles toward the Eurotas Valley. The river runs low and green in the summer heat, and the cicadas saw at the air without stopping. The sun is dropping behind Mount Taygetus, the same ridge that holds the ravine where the elders once decided whether he was fit to live. Its shadow stretches across the road ahead of him now. He is not thinking about the Thebans who drove him off the field. That is behind him. He is thinking about the city in front. He is thinking about one face. He passes through the streets. Sparta had no great walls. Its founders boasted that the courage of its men was wall enough. So there is no gate to stop him, no barrier at all, only the open road running into a settlement of low houses and dusty lanes. No crowd, no shouting, only doorways, and behind them, eyes tracking him from the dark, A woman at a loom stops her hands. A child is pulled back inside. He makes his way toward the house he was born in, and there she stands, framed in the low doorway, his mother. She heard the news before he arrived. She knows the battle was lost. She knows her son is one of the handful who came back breathing. He stops in front of her, coated in the grime of the retreat, the dried blood of other men crusted on his forearms. He searches her face for anything at all: pity, rage, a flicker of relief that he is alive. Her face gives him none of it. It is blank as unmarked stone. Behind her, somewhere in the house, is a roof made of tiles. He survived the war. Now he has to survive the peace, and the marrow freezes in his bones as he understands the truth of it. His life is no longer his to keep. It never was. It is hers, and she has not yet decided what to do with it. The city did not call him a survivor. The law had a word ready for men like him, and it was worse than any curse: tresas, the trembler, not an insult thrown across a tavern, a legal status, filed and recognized by the ephors, the 5 magistrates elected each year, who held even the kings in check. Each year those 5 men swore an oath to the kings, and the kings swore back. And part of what the ephors guarded was exactly this: the honor of every fighting man, as fixed as a title carved in stone. And it worked as a death sentence that let the body keep walking around. Herodotus gives us the man who put a face to it: Aristodemus. He was one of the 300 Spartiots Leonidas led north to the pass at Thermopylae in 480 BC. One of the men picked to hold the gap where the mountain of Lacedaemon crowds down against the sea. The place was named for its hot sulfur springs, the water steaming out of the rock, and the ground underfoot smelled of it. A single road ran through, narrow enough at points that a cart could barely pass. Across the mouth of the pass stood an old wall the Phocians had built long before, and the Greeks rebuilt it to fight behind. Xerxes had brought an army so large, Herodotus claimed it drank rivers dry. Leonidas had brought a few thousand, and the 300 full Spartiates at the core of them were men who already had living sons at home. That detail is deliberate. The ephors chose men whose bloodlines would continue even after the fathers fell in the pass. They were sending men they expected to bury. Aristodemus was meant to die there with the rest. He did not. In the last days before the final stand, 2 men in that camp were struck by a savage infection of the eyes that swelled them shut and left them nearly blind. Aristodemus was one. A soldier named Eurytus was the other. Leonidas dismissed the pair and sent them back to a village to recover. Then the word came down. A local man named Ephialtes, hoping for a Persian reward, had shown the enemy the goat track over the shoulder of the mountain, the path the Greeks called the Enopeia. The Persians were coming around the back. The men holding the pass were surrounded. The final morning had arrived, and Leonidas ordered most of the allied Greeks to leave while there was still time. The Spartans stayed. Eurytus, blind, groping in the dark of his own ruined eyes, called for his helot and told the slave to arm him. He could not see the sun. He ordered the helot to lead him by the hand back toward the fighting. He walked into a press of bodies he could not see and was killed in it. His helot turned and ran. That was one choice. Aristodemus made the other. He stayed in the village. He recovered. He lived. And when the war moved on and he came home to Sparta, he came home alone, the single breathing man of the 300. Herodotus adds a bitter footnote. A third man, Pantites, had been sent as a messenger to Thessaly and missed the battle through no fault of his own. When Pantites returned to Sparta and found himself dishonored, he hanged himself. The shame alone was enough to put a rope in his hands. Aristodemus did not have that release. He had not fled the line. He had not dropped his shield in the dust to save his legs. A commander had ordered him out of the camp, and a sickness in his eyes had kept him from the slaughter. On paper, he held every excuse a man could ask for. It bought him nothing. Sparta looked at Aristodemus and did not see a man fate had spared. It saw a man who had failed to find his death when his brothers found theirs. His heartbeat was the accusation. They named him Aristodemus the coward, and the name stuck like tar. No citizen would speak to him, no man would hand him fire to light his hearth, no one would sit near him at the common table. He moved through the lanes of his own city like a spirit that had forgotten to leave. Herodotus follows the story to its strange end. A year later, in 479 BC, the Greeks met the Persians in the field at Plataea, and the Spartans held the right wing under the regent Pausanias. Aristodemus was there, and he fought like a man trying to buy his soul back with his body. He broke from the phalanx, which no Spartan was ever supposed to do, and threw himself at the enemy in a fury, killing until he was killed. He wanted to die, and he wanted the whole army to watch him do it. After the battle, the Spartans debated who had fought best. Some named Aristodemus, but the judges refused him the honor. They said he had thrown his life away in a private madness to escape his shame, while other men like Posidonius, had held their ground and done their duty in their right minds. Even his death did not clean the name. That was the machine, and that was the fate coiled and waiting for the son standing in his mother's doorway in the valley of the Eurotas. The son who had failed her one command. The disgrace was never left to gossip and cold looks. It was engineered. It was made visible so a tresas could never slip into a crowd, never once forget what he was. His shame was stitched into the cloth on his back. He wore a cloak sewn from patches of clashing colors, a garment built to be ugly, made to drag every eye in the agora toward him and turn it to scorn. Every step broadcast his failure ahead of him. But Xenophon, who lived among these people and sent his own sons through their schooling, recorded a punishment sharper than any cloak because it worked on the mind. The trembler had to shave off half his beard, only half, sit with that image, in a world where a hoplite's full beard was the badge of a grown man, of a citizen who had earned his place at the fire. This man walked into the street with a face split down the middle. One cheek a man, one cheek scraped bare like a boy's. He woke each morning and found that face waiting for him in the polished bronze mirror. He could not fix it. He could not hide it. Every person he passed read the same sentence off his skin. This is not a whole man. This is a thing broken in half by his own nerve. No brand seared into flesh could say it plainer, and he had to renew the message himself with a razor, morning after morning, his own hand doing the work of his own humiliation. His erasure from Spartan life was total. Everything that made a man a Spartiate was stripped away one piece at a time. He could hold no office. He had no voice in the assembly, the appella, where the citizens roared their votes, and the loudest shout carried the day. He was locked out of the public games, his strength now a thing to be ashamed of. He was thrown out of the syssitia, the mess groups of 15 men, who ate the same barley, cheese, figs, and black broth from the same pot every night of their lives, and whose membership was the very definition of citizenship. That broth was so foul that a visitor from another city, after one taste, said he finally understood why Spartans did not fear death. A man voted out of his mess ceased in practice to be a Spartan at all. The trembler ate alone. He aged alone. On the street, the law bent every other citizen's path over him. He gave way even to boys young enough to be his sons. He dropped his eyes. Any man could strike him and answer to no one. He had no court, no defense, no recourse. A trembler was a body the whole city was licensed to punish, a vessel Sparta poured its fear and its anger into, a scapegoat whose suffering told everyone else they were still clean. And the cruelest cut waited at the root. He was forbidden to marry, and Plutarch adds a further blow. No man would give a trembler his daughter, and no man would take a wife from a trembler's family. So the shame spread sideways through the bloodline and poisoned the marriage prospects of his kin. This was the state waging war on his line itself. Sparta had ruled that his cowardice ran in the blood like a fever, and a fever must not breed. His name went out like a snuffed lamp, unremembered, stained. No son to carry the shield he had shamed, no son to redeem him. The elders had cut him from the family tree of the city with their own hands. A branch lopped off, so the rot could not climb the trunk. A man with no descendants and no future, haunting a past he had betrayed, and the hand that started the machine turning, the first and heaviest hand of all, was his mother's. Her rejection was the trigger. When a son came home in disgrace, the whole city watched the mother first. Her face was the signal fire. If she met him with fury, if she mourned him aloud as though he had died in the line, Sparta took its cue and closed ranks behind her. She was expected to conduct a living funeral for a child whose heart still beat in his chest. She treated him as a corpse. She would not speak to him. She would not turn her eyes to where he stood. Her door stayed barred. As far as she was concerned, the son she had raised had died in the field, and the thing that had come home wearing his face was a fraud, a shame she was appalled to have carried out of her own body. Blood counted for nothing against a failure of nerve. Plutarch hands us the words of one such mother, spoken to a son who had run. She did not hiss it in a corner. She said it out loud for the street to hear. It is falsely reported that you are alive and have fled. My true son died holding his shield. If you are living, you are no son of mine. That was not an argument. It was an execution by sentence. With those syllables, she cut him out of the family as cleanly as a butcher parts a joint. She chose an idea, Spartan honor, over the warm and living boy she had fed and raised. Plutarch collected dozens of these lines, and the pattern never once slips. Another mother, seeing her son approach after a defeat, cut him off before he could speak. "You wretch," she said, "where do you think you are running? Back in here, where you came from." And she lifted her dress to show him the womb that had borne him, as if to say, the only place a coward belonged was back inside it, unborn. Another handed her son his shield with the single word and sent him off. Another, whose 5 sons had all gone to a battle, met a man limping from the field and demanded news. He told her all 5 were dead. "Fool of a slave," she said, "I did not ask you that. I asked how fares our country." He told her Sparta was victorious. "Then," she said, "I gladly accept the death of my sons." Another told her son had been killed in the line where she had stationed him in her heart, said only that he was hers, and that the man who ran was not. These are the sayings the Spartans themselves chose to preserve and be proud of, not the ones they hid. This was the design running flawlessly. The state had handed off its harshest enforcement to the one human being a man is built from birth to trust without question. It took a mother's love and forged it into a reward that could be granted or torn away at will. Try to feel what that did to a Spartan boy inside the agog, the training school he entered at 7, where he was made to steal his own food and beaten if caught being seen, not for the theft, but for the clumsiness of getting caught, where boys slept on beds of reeds they tore from the Eurotas with their bare hands, no knife allowed, where each year they were whipped at the altar of Artemis Orthia in a contest to see who could take the lash longest without a sound. Plutarch says boys died under that whip rather than cry out, and their fathers stood watching and did not stop it. These sons grew up in a world where a mother's approval was chained to a boy's readiness to be cut down in a foreign field. Her pride cost blood, and she named the price without blinking. Her shame, meanwhile, was strong enough to unmake a person, to strip a citizen down to a ghost. It was the last fail-safe in the whole apparatus. If the agog and its years of hunger and lashes somehow failed, if terror of the enemy failed to plant a man's feet in the line, the terror of his mother's verdict would finish the job. There was always one more lock on the cage. But what happens when shame and social death are not enough? When a son's disgrace runs so deep no shunning can scrub it out? When the stain demands something more final than a barred door and a half-shaved face? Here the story crosses a line. It leaves the country of harsh conditioning and walks into something darker. We stop hearing recorded sayings and begin hearing recorded deeds. Plutarch, gathering the lore of Sparta, kept a story that marks the far edge of the whole ideology. The moment a mother stops being the judge and becomes the executioner. A woman in Sparta gets word from the front. The battle was a slaughter. Of 5 sons she had sent to the army, one lives. He lives because he ran, and he is coming home. She does not wait at her house to shame him. She does not gather the neighbors. She walks out to meet him on the road herself and stands there, watching the horizon for the shape of him. When he finally comes, limping, beaten, alone, she says nothing. For one heartbeat, he might have thought she had come to welcome him. He was wrong. In her hands she holds a heavy roof tile, the kind of baked clay tile that roofed every house in the valley, its edge rough against her palm. She walks toward her own son, her face set like carved stone, and without a single word of grief, she strikes him down and kills him there in the dust of the road. When they ask her afterward why, her answer comes level and short. She had sent 5 sons to war, she says, not to live and not to die, but so that Sparta would win. When she heard the army was destroyed, she feared for the city, and when she heard one of hers had bought his life by running, she said an unworthy son was a disgrace she could not carry, and neither could Sparta. So she wiped him out. She destroyed the defective thing she had made with her own body, using her own hands to do it. Whether it happened in exactly that way or not, the Greeks kept the story and told it again and again, because it held the truest truth of the Spartan machine. This was a society that had honed its ideology to such an edge that a mother could look at her living child and see not a life to be saved, but a defect to be corrected, and correct it in the road. The records that let us reconstruct all of this do not sit in one tidy volume. They are scattered across dozens of ancient writers, surviving in fragments, in stray lines, in a saying quoted by one author and half remembered by another. Herodotus for Thermopylae, Xenophon for the daily machinery of the tremblers, written by a man who watched it up close. Plutarch for the mother's own words, gathered in his sayings of Spartan women centuries after the fact, but drawing on older Spartan sources now lost. The main source behind the research for this video is a book that stands as a masterwork on the raw truth of the Spartan world, the volume that gathers these scattered fragments into one clear picture. It was the bedrock of today's story, and if you want to truly grasp the psychology underneath all this, you need it on your own shelf. It is available right now on our channel's shopping shelf. Tap the View Products button on your screen. That book is an archive of the discipline and the terror that forged this society out of flesh and fear. Beside it, we have gathered a set of dark relics, pieces that carry this history into your own home. Open the shelf now, while the story keeps moving, and look through the collection we put together for the most serious students of dark history. See what is waiting there for you. A system this tight, enforced by the mothers themselves, looks unbreakable. It looks perfect in its cold efficiency. It was built to manufacture one kind of human being, a man scrubbed clean of the instinct to save his own skin and to destroy anyone who failed to meet the mark. And for centuries it worked. Sparta broke Athens in the long war that ended in 404 BC, and for a generation it stood as the master of Greece. The resolve of its mothers was told and retold across the Greek world with a kind of horrified respect, spoken of as the deep foundation the whole power rested on. But a machine built for perfection is a brittle thing, a system that permits no error, no deviation, no survivors, carries a crack hidden in its own logic from the first day. And there was another crack, one Aristotle would name years later in his Politics. The Spartiates were vanishing. Land gathered in fewer and fewer hands. The number of full citizens fell decade by decade, from perhaps 8,000 in the time of the Persian Wars down toward 1,000, then fewer. Every son killed in a lost battle was a citizen the city could not replace. Every trembler forbidden to marry was a bloodline cut short by Sparta's own law. What happens when that machine is pushed harder than its makers ever dreamed? What happens when a single afternoon of fighting breaks not just a line of shields, but the whole creed of the state? A day is coming for Sparta, a field in Boeotia called Leuctra. A Theban general named Epaminondas, who has studied the phalanx and found the flaw in it, and a sacred band of picked fighters ready to exploit it. On that day, the tremblers who walk home will be too many to punish, so many that to enforce the law against all of them would be to disband what remains of the army itself. The iron logic of the mothers is about to slam headlong into the arithmetic of extinction, and one man, a king, is going to have to choose which law he is willing to break. The Greeks had a word for what was killing Sparta, and it had nothing to do with armies. It was a word about wombs and empty houses, oliganthropia, the scarcity of men. For generations, the rest of Greece looked at Sparta and saw a slab of granite, a war state that could not be dented. Inside that slab, something was hollowing out. The city was consuming itself from the marrow. The count of full citizens, the Spartiots, the ones who called themselves the homoioi, the equals, was falling and would not stop falling. Aristotle set the numbers down cold in his Politics, and he named the cause without flinching. The land had drifted into fewer and fewer hands, much of it into the hands of women who inherited it as brothers died in war, until, he wrote, nearly 2/5 of Spartan soil belonged to females. In the days of the Persian Wars, Sparta could put perhaps 8,000 of these men in the field. By the year that mattered most, it could barely find 700. A birth rate that shamed the elders so badly they had passed laws to force it up. Plutarch records the strange incentives. A man who fathered 3 sons was excused from the night watch. A man who fathered 4 was freed from every public burden the city could impose. Bachelors were paraded naked around the marketplace in winter and made to sing a song mocking themselves. None of it worked. The numbers kept dropping, because under all of it ran the logic of the code itself, and the code was written in the mouths of the mothers. The system demanded perfection, and threw a feast for death. Every son who obeyed his mother and came home, stretched out on his shield, was one more Spartan who would never father another. Every trembler cast out and forbidden a wife was a bloodline snuffed by law. Sparta had chased quality until it ran clean out of quantity. It was becoming a city of ghosts, an engine of war with the fuel gauge dropping toward empty. And the mothers had drained that tank themselves, one son at a time, and called each drop an honor. The poison had been thinning the city's blood for 100 years. In July of 371 BC, on a flat plain in Boeotia called Leuctra, southwest of Thebes, it finally reached the heart. The Spartan army, the thing every Greek child was raised to fear, faced Thebes. And Thebes had a mind at its head. Epaminondas, Xenophon, who lived in that age and disliked Thebes, still recorded the omens the Spartans carried into that day. A wind had torn the sacred ribbons from their tents. The oracles muttered. Even the Spartan officers grumbled that the ground and the signs were against them. Cleombrotus, the king, had been called soft on Thebes before, accused of sparing them too often, and he went into that battle needing a victory to save his own name at home. Plutarch adds a detail that says everything. Some of his officers, seeing the strength of the enemy line, urged him to fight, so no one could ever again call him a coward. There is a darker note in the sources, too. The Spartans had shared out too much wine at the midday meal before the battle, and some of the men who formed up on the right went into the fight with the heat of it still in them. The Spartans lined up the way they always had, a wall of bronze and muscle, spears leveled, scarlet cloaks in the July heat, certain of a formation that had crushed every foe for 2 centuries. Every man's shield bore the letter lambda, the mark of Lacedaemon, painted large so the enemy would know who was killing him. Epaminondas threw the rulebook in the dirt. He did not spread his strength evenly across the line the way every Greek general had done for as long as anyone could remember. He piled it onto his left wing, stacking it 50 men deep, a column of pure weight, and he tilted his whole line back at an angle so that this hammer would strike the Spartan right first and hardest, exactly where Cleombrotus stood with his royal guard, exactly where the whole army was anchored. He held his weaker right wing back, refusing battle there, so the Spartans could not use their advantage across the rest of the field. Ahead of that column marched the Sacred Band of Thebes, 300 picked fighters, paired lovers sworn never to abandon one another, led by Pelopidas, who saw the moment and charged before the Spartan line could dress itself. Before them came the cavalry, and the Theban horse rode down the weaker Spartan riders and drove them back into their own infantry, fouling the ranks just as the column struck. The 2 lines closed. The sound of that first collision, thousands of men and the shields between them rolled across the plain like the sky splitting. Dust rose in a wall. Men could not see the enemy until the enemy was on top of them, and by then the weight of 50 ranks was driving the Spartan front backward off its feet. The Spartan right did not hold. It could not. Cleombrotus went down, cut in the crush, dragged still living out of the front by his men, and dead before they got him clear. He was one of only 2 Spartan kings ever killed in a pitched battle. Around him, his guard died in a ring, including Dinon the polemarch and Sphodrius, whose reckless raid on Athens years before had helped drag Sparta into this war in the first place. Sphodrius fell there, and his son Cleonymus fell across him, the 2 of them ending in the same heap of the same slaughter their family had helped set in motion. And then the thing no Greek had ever watched happened in front of the whole army. The Spartan phalanx, the living proof that discipline could not be broken, broke. The Spartiots who still stood, men raised from the cradle on 4 words, with it or on it, turned their backs and ran. They left their dead king in the dirt. Of roughly 700 full Spartiates on that field, 400 were dead by the time the dust settled. Nearly 300 lived. They lived by running. In one afternoon, under one July sun, 300 men became tremblers all at once. The oldest faith in Greece had been put to its final test and had failed. The myth of the invincible Spartan bled out on the Boeotian plain, and the laws that guarded that myth were still standing, untouched, back home in the valley of the Eurotas. Then came the part that shamed them even more than the running. The Spartans asked Epaminondas for a truce to gather their dead, the ancient ritual by which the loser of a Greek battle admitted defeat. But Epaminondas suspected they meant to hide how many Spartiots had fallen among the ordinary dead, so he let the allied cities collect their fallen first. When the Spartan corpses were left alone on the field, the true count stood exposed for every Greek to see, 400 of the equals in the dirt, the pride of Lacedaemon laid out for counting. Plutarch tells us how the news landed. It reached Sparta on the last day of the Gymnopaedia, the summer festival, while the men's chorus was singing in the theater, and the whole city sat watching the boys dance in the heat. The ephors received the casualty list mid-festival. They did not stop the dancing. They let the chorus finish the song. Then they went house to house and read out the names of the dead. And here Plutarch records something that turns the whole story inside out. The next morning, the relatives of the men who had died walked the streets bright-faced, greeting one another, proud. The relatives of the survivors stayed shut inside their houses with the women, hiding, ashamed. The mothers whose sons had come home alive were the ones in mourning. The mothers whose sons had died were the ones wearing joy in the open like a festival garland. That single dawn holds the whole truth of the Spartan mother in one frozen image. The news that reached Sparta was not a report of a lost battle. It was the collapse of a religion. An entire generation of the city's warriors were now, by the plain letter of their own sacred law, cowards, tremblers, men who had earned the patched cloak, the half-shaved beard, the closed door, the lifetime of every citizen stepping over them in the street. The city stood at a fork, with a blade down each path. Follow the law of Lycurgus, the code that had made them everything they were, and they would have to strip 300 surviving soldiers of citizenship in a single stroke, gutting what remained of an army that was all that stood between Sparta and a Thebes now free to march south. That was national suicide committed at the altar of principle. Ignore the law, pretend the code did not reach these men, and they would be confessing out loud that the whole savage faith they lived by was conditional. A fine-weather belief, a story they told themselves that folded the moment reality pushed back hard enough. Into that fork stepped an old king, Agesilaus II, He was past 70 by then, small, lame from birth in one leg, a man Plutarch says had come up through the full machine, the agage, the mess, the code carved into his bones, and who had ruled Sparta as its guiding hand for decades. He had not been at Leuctra, laid up by illness in his own account, which spared his name the stain the dead kings carried. He was one of the sharpest political minds the city had produced in a century, and he saw a Sparta frozen between destroying its army and betraying its soul. He knew the law could not be enforced and could not be abandoned, so he built a door out of nothing. Plutarch preserves what he did, and the wording matters. The city turned to Agesilaus and effectively handed him the law itself, asked him to be lawgiver for the day. He did not claim the runners had been brave. He did not twist the meaning of the statute. He did something stranger than either. He asked the city to stop time. He declared, with the weight of his office, that the laws should sleep for this one day, and from tomorrow be in full force again. Let the laws sleep today. That was the phrase Plutarch hands us. And from tomorrow let them govern as before. One day of pretending the law did not exist. It was a gamble born of a man with nothing left to lose. It was also a public confession. The Spartan system, in its pure and undiluted form, was unlivable. It was too brittle to survive the mess of the real world, where enemies got clever and defeats came total. For the first time since Lycurgus, the state chose survival over honor, and said so in front of everyone. The vote carried. The survivors of Leuctra were not stripped, not shamed, not shaved. They were folded quietly back into the ranks. The crisis passed, but the spell was gone. The machine had been shown to have an off switch, and everyone had watched a king reach for it. A people who had defined themselves by absolute, unbending obedience to a code had just admitted out loud that the code would kill them if they let it run. And somewhere in the city that day, the mothers who had waited near the gates, ready to perform the old and terrible duty, ready to turn stone faces on their returning sons, were told to stand down. The state had blinked first. The mothers were not needed. That, more than the dead king, was the true end of Sparta as it had been. The moment laid bare a flaw that had been hiding in the open for generations. The mothers had done their work too well. They had raised men who were masters of one thing above all others, dying, men who would hold a line until it killed them, who would choose the shield over their own lives, who would honor the contract to the last breath. But in perfecting the art of the glorious death, they had built a society with no answer for a survivable defeat. A culture that worshipped the beautiful ending had nothing to say when the ending was ugly, and everyone lived through it. The mothers had bred warriors for a world that always rewarded Spartan discipline. When a new kind of enemy arrived, one who thought harder and struck deeper, the perfect sons were all lying dead at Leuctra, and the men who came home were a problem the system could not touch without shattering. The weaponized love that was meant to be Sparta's unbreakable guarantee turned out to be the crack that broke it. It produced men who could not adapt. It set a culture so rigid it could only stand or snap, never bend. The mothers had treated the instinct to survive as a moral rot and cut it out of their sons. They had spent their own children like coin until the treasury stood empty. In chasing the perfect soldier, they had helped engineer the ruin of the army that soldier belonged to. The success and the failure were the same thing wearing two faces. The very fanaticism they poured into their boys, that hunger for a good death, was exactly what left Sparta unable to rise again after a single bad afternoon. They had raised a generation of martyrs, and no city was ever built out of martyrs alone. A state needs survivors too, and Sparta had taught its survivors to be ashamed of breathing. What came after Leuctra was a slide with no bottom that mattered. The winter after the battle, Epaminondas marched a great army down into the Peloponnese, into Laconia itself, and stood on the far bank of the Eurotas, looking across at Sparta. No enemy army had come that close in 400 years. Xenophon, who lived in the region, and whose own son fought and died in the cavalry of these years, records the sight of smoke rising from the villages of the Spartan homeland, while the old men and the women watched from the unwalled city. Sparta had never built walls. It had boasted for centuries that the courage of its men was wall enough. Now that boast stood naked on the riverbank, and there were not enough men left to make good on it. Agesilaus, old and lame, held the city together in those days by refusing to let his few soldiers rush out to fight, holding them back street by street while the enemy burned the fields in sight of the women's windows. Plutarch says the women of Sparta, who had never seen an enemy in their lives, panicked at the smoke and the shouting, and that their terror unnerved the men more than the Thebans did. Then Epaminondas did the thing that finished Sparta for good. He crossed into Messenia, the land the Spartans had conquered and enslaved 3 centuries before, and he freed the Helots, the vast enslaved population whose forced labor had fed the entire Spartan machine, and freed every Spartiate to do nothing but train for war. Epaminondas gathered the scattered Messenians, some from as far as Sicily and Africa where they had fled, and in 369 BC he built them a city, Messene, with real walls of cut stone on the slopes of Mount Ithome. The walls still stand today, some of the finest in the ancient world, raised as a monument against Sparta. The foundation the whole Spartan world had rested on was pulled out in a single season. The men who ate the black broth in the mess halls could no longer eat, because the hands that grew their barley were free. Sparta never got its power back. It shrank into a curiosity, a place travelers visited centuries later to see what a legend looked like once the terror had drained out of it. A later king, Agesilaus IV, tried to revive the old code and the old land laws, and was strangled in prison for it. His successor, Cleomenes III, tried again with the sword, and was crushed by Macedon at Silesia in 222 BC. Under Rome, the city survived as a kind of theme park of itself, where paying visitors could watch boys still being flogged at the altar of Artemis Orthia, the old ritual kept alive as a tourist spectacle long after it had lost all meaning, some boys dying under the lash for an audience of Roman sightseers. The mothers went on, teaching their sons the old words, but the words had lost the force behind them. The state had already chosen life over the code once in public, and everyone remembered. Her memory survived, but scrubbed clean. We keep the Spartan mother as a poster of resolve, a tidy symbol of devotion, and we quote her one famous line as though it were a verse to hang on a wall. The record underneath is darker and sadder than the poster. She was the most effective piece in a machine that ground its own people to powder, and she was one of its victims too. A woman ordered by her culture to sever the oldest bond in nature, to look at her own children as state property, polished for glory or thrown out as scrap. Her love was weaponized so completely that it helped bleed a whole civilization white, one dead son at a time. And the question her story leaves in the room has nothing to do with courage. It is a question about belief itself. Is any faith worth keeping if the price of its perfection is the bodies of your own children, thank you for staying to the very end of this one. If this story reached something in you, and if you believe history like this deserves to be dragged back into the light instead of left buried, subscribe to the channel, hit like, and send this to one person who needs to hear it. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Now look at your screen. Another descent into the dark places of the past is already waiting for you there. Click it. Keep going down. We will meet you on the other side.